I think the MLB network calls this bonus coverage. You get to hear from two Washington lawyers back to back about regulation. Be sure to buy a lottery ticket on your way home. You are lucky. Or I could talk about politics. I did what the president does every night. Last night when I got to my hotel room, I watched cable news till I passed out. So I'm brimming with political expertise. It's crazy in Washington, isn't it? It's just crazy. This gets a little boring. Google crazy Washington, D.C. You'll get some interesting new articles and insights on the mental state of the first president and the current president. Trump's in trouble. He really is. The Republican agenda is in trouble. But partisanship still rules in the District of Columbia. You need to know one number. While the majority of citizens believe that the president's job has been unsatisfactory, 84% of Republicans think he's doing just fine. Now that was before this week, but that's what's key. 75% of evangelicals thinks he's the cat's meow. So it sort of reminds me of the old joke of the old senator who lay dying in his deathbed and he whispered to his aide, "I want to re-register as a Democrat." Senator, you're 95 years old, you've been a Republican all your life, you served longer than anyone else in the US Senate, what in the world are you thinking? He says, when I go, I want the other side to lose one. Underlying all the chaos in Washington remains a churning federal bureaucracy. And that's what we want to focus on because of the significance to our business. I think that we lose a little focus in the country because we've had presidents the last two times of different parties for 8 years. But power does change in an election. And what's happened this time around is that the conservatives won big, and the extremely conservative conservatives. And we're returning to some of the conservative political positions that we have seen before in Washington. Trump has had a really big focus on addressing regulatory burdens on business. I want to talk about deconstructing the administrative state and the cost of regulation, but this is not a new theme. This is something that conservatives said before. So I looked up President Reagan's first State of the Union address. At that time, conservatives were angry that President Carter had started a Department of Education, and he vowed to dismantle the Department of Education. Well, you see on the right, that didn't happen because they're spending almost $90 billion today in their budget. And some of the things you hear about in the news in Washington are echoes from the Contract for America. What's important and what's happened since the election has been a government slowdown. And there are several aspects of this. The first is that the president gets to appoint a lot of people, and that process has been going painfully slowly. Before the beginning of the month, the Post reported that only 25 folks out of over 500 had actually been confirmed to their positions. Trump actually said on TV, what do all these people do? You don't need all these jobs. Even if you think government is bloated, I would refer to the other statement here in the news from a former White House Chief of Staff who actually served before that as CEO of the Arkla company. He said, common sense suggests that it's pretty hard to run any business if you don't have the people to do it. That includes the people that are hired by the government to make sure that the government doesn't commit waste, fraud, and abuse. There are a lot of inspector general positions in different agencies that are vacant. So the bureaucracy is churning on without that oversight right now. And importantly, the theme of the new administration of regulatory reform has to be executed by somebody. But if positions are vacant, that's not necessarily going to happen. This happened by a traditional regulatory pause. It's not unusual for an administration to come in and say, don't issue any regulations for 30 days while we get a lay of the land and put some of our people in charge. Because of the big change in political power, where the Republicans control the Congress and the administration, 90 regulations were held up over the first couple of months. And we implemented something called the Congressional Review Act. But I would make the point that regulation is not necessarily opposed by business. Regulation brings order to markets. It answers questions. It creates structures. It resolves disputes. So one great example for this group is PHMSA. And at the end of April, the House Transportation Subcommittee that oversees PHMSA had a hearing. And the representative from the American Petroleum Institute said he was quite disappointed at the pace of regulation from PHMSA. You may be too. So contrary to maybe a societal review that business doesn't like regulation, the API guys would like to see some of these rules be finished. He said, one of the things that our industry depends on is consistency. These companies plan out multi-million-dollar projects, billion-dollar projects. The expectation is that when they're investing in these projects, they're going to know what they need to do when they actually build the projects that take multiple years. So business is getting nervous that across the government, there is regulation delay on some things that they want to see. One unusual thing that's happened that very few people know about was a law passed as part of that Contract of America period that got no attention for a decade. The Congressional Review Act required that starting in '96, an agency had to send their rule for a review by the General Accounting Office, and Congress had the chance to review it before it became final. If Congress decided they didn't like the rule and the president agreed, they could nullify the regulation. It's part of an idea to return more power to the people's house from faceless bureaucrats. It's a very political statement, but it's very powerful. One of the provisions of the law is that if the topic of the regulation that Congress nullifies is, if the regulation is nullified, that topic can't be addressed again. So if Congress were to nullify and the president agreed a Department of Energy hot water efficiency rule, the Department of Energy could pass no more hot water efficiency rules ever. So it's a very consequential result. And not surprisingly, until this year, hello, I got a bad button. Oops. There we go. You see this ramp up in reviews that very few people paid attention to this law. But dozens of these laws have been teed up and 13 have been repealed, a lot of them environmental. For example, there was a rule on effluents into streams from mountaintop coal regulation that got passed, and that rule was destroyed. This methane flaring rule survived last week. This was a rule that applied only to drilling on federal lands and required better efforts to cut flaring, which was pretty rampant in North Dakota when those discoveries were made a few years ago, if you ever saw that famous photograph of the country at night. But on May 10th, repealing that regulation lost a procedural vote in the Senate. It was the first time in this Congress the Republicans had failed to pass a vote. What happened? Well, Senator Collins from Maine, Lindsey Graham, and John McCain voted with the Democrats. And a lot of people, the Wall Street Journal this week wrote an editorial that was a big warning sign for the power of the Trump administration. Deconstructing the administrative state is a phrase that's being made popular by the president's chief aide, Steve Bannon. Not quite sure where he got it from, but what it means is limited government. It means hold back the government from regulation creep. As you know, we have an increasingly complex society, and the regulations go along with that. You know, the basic idea of government is that Congress passes a law, but when the topic is involved, they ask an agency to pass regulations to implement the law. This is why there are so many lawyers in Washington. We've gotten to the point where the regulations themselves are not precise enough, and agencies began the practice in the last decade of issuing more and more guidance to explain what the regulations meant. Now, the IRS has always done that, and they're the biggest pile of regulations out there. But a lot of people are doing that, and there's a lot of pushback on that. One vehicle is, as I said, to have dusted off the Congressional Review Act. But these things aren't simple questions. How do you determine the value of a rule? Generally, people don't like the idea of regulations, but they like the idea of clean air. So it depends what kind of question you ask them, whether they're in favor of this kind of deconstruction. Now, what we clearly have had since January 17th is government by executive order. We're up to 40 plus. There's another one this week. What's ironic, of course, is that candidate Trump went around the country excoriating Obama for his expansion of executive power, which included the issuance of a lot of executive orders. So a lot of the executive orders have been to undo Obama's executive orders. Let's talk about the energy executive orders for a second. Let me just tick through those. Let me say, by way of background also, that executive power is not without checks. The courts can check the power of the president. So we well know that the executive order trying to implement a Muslim travel ban was held in abeyance by the federal courts. And I'm not certain of this, but the majority, if not all, of these rules have gone to court for different reasons. We'll talk about the ones that matter to us. So the first one was expediting environmental reviews and approvals for high priority infrastructure projects, a kind of common sense idea that we wanted to streamline regulations for infrastructure. But that includes the electric grid and pipelines specifically. Then a general theme, which is repeated in several of the orders, is to reform regulation, reduce it, change the process, whatever needs to be done to make it more business friendly. And one of those things was to create a regulatory reform officer in every agency. So we're adding a bureaucrat to get rid of bureaucrats. No, let's skip one. What am I doing on this button that's wrong? Guys, what am I doing wrong on this? You go left to go backwards? Yeah. There we go. Here's an important one. Promoting energy independence and economic growth. The president's theme hasn't just been to bring back the coal industry, but to accentuate America's energy resources. Jeff mentioned the current chair of FERC. Happened to have a meeting with her last December, and we had a discussion. Well, what exactly have we been doing to hold back the production of oil and gas in the Marcellus and Utica? It's booming. One of the ironies, I think, of the Obama administration is, for the first time, oil and gas industry didn't have the first seat at the table when it came to making policy. And yet the American oil and gas industry has never been healthier, never been bigger, all because of shale. So there's a sense that we want to do more, but I'm not exactly sure what it is we can do more of, but the agencies are under instruction to figure that out. Implementing an America First offshore energy strategy. There's a bit of a confusion about how to develop the offshore because all sorts of local interests get involved, whether they want to see windmills out in the water or oil rigs. So there's a sweeping executive order to get the relevant agencies involved to review whether we're restraining offshore development inappropriately. One big development last week was where I live, the state of Maryland authorized 2 big wind offshore projects that will put Maryland out there in front of most of the coastal states in the country. Jeff mentioned this one, and it's maybe the biggest one. The president extolled a rather simple idea that if we're going to add a regulation, we should take 2 off because there's too many of them. But as we know, we're familiar with PIMSA rules. They're complex. So what constitutes a regulation and what constitutes taking one off and adding another one? It's a very difficult proposition. The power to do that is going to reside in the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. In this executive order and another one are creating huge new power for that director, who's a former congressman from South Carolina, and his staff, which has to be extraordinarily overworked today because of a couple of executive orders. It only took a few days for the then interim director, the guy who was the staff person who was there before Mulvaney was confirmed, to issue a clarification of the executive order that was 5 times longer than the executive order. So many questions are raised. One of the answers was that an independent regulatory agency like FERC that Jeff talked about isn't technically covered by this rule. It covers the cabinet offices, if you will, Department of Defense, Department of Interior, and so on. This was a rule that got to court very quickly by consumer and environmental interests. And just yesterday or Monday, in federal court, arguments were held on whether this regulation is constitutional. And there are ins and outs, but the concept would be that if Congress passes a law and says that the agency should do this, how is it that the president can come along and say, don't do that anymore? So it's a constitutional issue of the powers of the presidency there that's being litigated, and that will take a while to do it. The other part about this executive order is it's creating a process to implement the notion that you have to budget for a new regulation, that you can't pass a new regulation unless you've figured out a budget for that ahead of time, and that budget's been signed off by Central, which is OMB. That's all I can understand about that process right now. Obviously, it would be really hard to pull that off, but that's what they're trying to do. So that is a great example of how the OMB has this new power. But they're difficult questions. For example, how do you assess the cost benefit of a new blowout preventer rule if it's going to actually prevent something, another Deepwater Horizon accident, whose costs were, just enormous? All this adds up to a great deal of regulatory uncertainty, which I said at the outset is really something that business doesn't like. This is a good one. When Trump addressed the Keystone Pipeline, one of the first things he was going to do was to clear the way for the Keystone Pipeline to bring oil from Canada all the way down to the Gulf Coast. he famously said, while they were preparing the executive order, hey, I got a good idea. Let's make sure we build that pipeline with steel. Seems like a good idea at the time. The problem was all the steel had been purchased for the Keystone Pipeline quite a while ago, and it wasn't all from America. So they had to exempt the Keystone Pipeline right away from the rule that was done to create the pathway for the Keystone to be approved. And the idea of America First, the president's inaugural speech theme, was played out immediately here with pipeline construction. But what does it mean? Two stories illustrate the problem. As you all know, a lot of environmentalists have been going to great lengths to protest pipeline construction and trying everything they can. And by the way, they have failed almost in every venue and every step of the way, and continue to do so with their legal arguments. But one inventive group probably broke into a pipeline yard and crawled inside the pipelines and saw that the pipeline was made in Greece. And they said, aha, it would be illegal to install this pipeline. Stop what you're doing. Better story is that this company in Arkansas is the company that makes really big diameter pipeline. They're the only one. And they are clearly participants in the world market for steel. And they purchase from vendors all around the world to create the kind of steel that they want to do for this particular pipeline. So this nice sounding executive order is fraught with details, and the pipeline industry is a little bit beside itself in trying to work out a solution. Oops. I think you're all familiar with PHMSA and the fact that they no longer have an administrator. What's significant to me is that the prior administrator took a long time to get processed through an appointment, and she was a strong partisan who left as soon as the election, right after the election, with absolutely no fanfare at all. She just kind of slipped away. But at the same time, the work that PHMSA is doing is largely one of the most bipartisan things going on in Washington. No one's really opposed to pipeline safety. They want it to be done right. And because of, you all know, the Pipes Act was passed just a year ago on a bipartisan basis, and it instructed PHMSA to take many actions, but it's way behind, as you know. Over in the Department of Energy, we do have an energy secretary, former Governor Perry of Texas, and while fossil fuels is the priority of the administration, it's a bit ironic that the biggest wind state in the country is Texas. So the governor is very familiar with the benefits of wind. I'd be surprised if he took actions adverse to that industry. What we have heard a lot about are cutbacks in personnel at DOE and a change in the philosophy of the appliance efficiency energy people at the EERE, the office that does that. Recently, an appointment was made of a lawyer, Dan Simmons, who has worked against those rules in his career in Washington for different interest groups that he works for. And in fact, his boss at one of the groups was head of the DOE landing team or transition team. So the power of that ideology is being felt in the way policies, I think, will be made going forward. One of those policies that my client APGA has been involved in for a while, along with AGA, is the natural gas furnace rule. DOE tried to impose a new standard of efficiency in 2011, didn't follow the rules correctly. We took them to court. They started over, and comments on the rule were last filed just before the inauguration, and that rule's pending. APJ has a magazine called Source that I published an article in this edition that talks about not just the history of this rule, but how the Department of Energy has aligned itself with the deep decarbonization movement of environmentalists. There's a movement that wants to end the use of fossil fuels, and that includes the direct use of natural gas in homes. The furnace rule would be a step in that direction, and I'd expect that the new administration will mute, if not moot, that direction. What's interesting is that Simmons is only one of 9 political slots at DOE, and he's the only one that's been appointed so far. So there are no troops on the ground at DOE or really any other agency. Jeff handled the subject of FERC. I would just point out a couple of things. The confirmation process takes a while, and when the quorum left almost 4 months ago now, we all thought, well, 2 or 3 months, that's not a big deal. The trains will be kept running on time with the delegated authority of directors of offices to issue letter orders. The really big stuff could hold off for 2 or 3 months, and they almost cleared out the closet of pipeline certificate orders on February 3rd. Now a few months have gone by and the industry's getting pretty nervous. And the thing to look ahead to is, number one, the Senate August recess. That's a deadline. Number two, the potential that Senate Democrats could block a nomination with some Republican support because they don't want to approve 2 Republicans at one time. Usually these things involve a package of both parties so everybody's happy. This is a rather aggressive move to hold back on filling a Democratic position at the agency. So what is an America First energy policy? We know that the president told the coal miners he would get their jobs back, but very few people believe that'll happen. Most people believe natural gas killed coal, not the EPA. I believe that the energy markets are more determinative of energy policy today than anything Congress or FERC does. Our industry is largely deregulated, and the markets seem to work okay. I also think it's a bit of a falsehood or canard that FERC takes too long to approve pipeline projects. They've actually slimmed down their process as much as possible, staffed it appropriately, and expedited their decisions. The only thing that has thwarted them in the last couple of years is the sheer volume of citizen input and protest that takes time to sort through. And it's unlikely that much could be done about that. Something new that's happening with pipeline permission is at the state level. While pipelines are having their way getting FERC to approve them, whenever FERC makes an approval, it's always subject to some routine local and state permitting that has to happen. You have to go to this state office or this local office to get a permit to do X or Y. And that hasn't been a problem until recently. Recently, the city council, or maybe not the city council, but the city of Nashville, Tennessee, of all places, held up an air permit for months to push back the schedule of a Kinder Morgan, Tennessee pipeline project. They just relented and issued it, but it was delayed months and months. And here in New England, in Massachusetts, the town of Weymouth, is that how you say it? Or does it have a New England pronunciation? Has been fighting tooth and nail about this compressor station that Algonquin wants to put in its Atlantic Bridge project that's in an industrial area, but they're still fighting tooth and nail. And that project is captive to a state process that will take some time still. It was something that is kind of like the old idea that, well, you don't pass. Well, how do I pass? We'll come back again. When can I come back again? Well, we're closed for the next 6 months. Kind of a classic situation there. So watch for states to exert their authority. We know that New York has exerted its authority and opinion about fracking. and has dragged its feet on some pipeline proposals. That's going to continue. What about alternative fuels? You all know many alternative fuels get tax breaks or tax incentive tax credits. And conservatives in general don't believe in that. They believe in a level playing field. So we might think that those are on the chopping block. But curiously, in February, President Trump expressed his endorsement to the ethanol industry. So who knows? Now, solar and wind developers may not have the same fate as the ethanol industry, but at the same time, as the Secretary of Energy knows, solar is a big job creator. So may not be too difficult. The government may not make it too hard on solar either. Infrastructure is a topic of executive orders and other presidential initiatives. And this is something to watch in our industry, but it's not as clear how this will help our industry as much as it would build roads. The Republicans would like to see this be a project not funded by tax dollars as much as by private equity. And that means that you have to create a project that creates some kind of return for private investors. And we can see that happening with a toll road. I find it harder to see how a piece of utility equipment could quite accomplish the same result. But the investment banks are giving this a lot of attention and meeting with the administration to find ways to issue some structured finance opportunities for themselves that will lead to an infrastructure boom. And there's so much more. Big topic is deconstructing the EPA. Cutting the positions there into EPA, defunding certain initiatives. The Energy Star program may be defunded and therefore ended, for example. And pulling back on all the lawsuits that are pending in court by pulling a rule back so the court's only too happy to let go of the suit. Interestingly, as part of the general regulatory reform process, all the agencies are asking for public comment on what can be fixed. As I said before, asking industry and business, how can we fix a process that's broken for you, that's holding up your ability to plan for capital expansion and hire people? When the EPA did this, and they were first out of the block, more or less, their comment period ended this week, and they ended up with 25,000 comments from citizens saying, don't change any environmental regulations. Also, tax reform is out there that will have a bearing on our industry. It might change, for example, the master limited partner regulations, which a lot of pipelines enjoy that structure. And if they change the rules on that, they may have to reform their structures. Lastly, this would be my prognostication, handicapping energy sources. The domestic oil and gas business is going up. You can't beat low prices and reliable service. It's the best game in town. It's not getting any smaller. It's employing a lot of people. It has the full support of the government. It faces the challenge from environmentalists in the United States and in the world. I don't think anything will change in the coal business. It's pretty much too far gone. If anything, they might be able to retain more of their exports of coal. But coal's not going to be burned much longer in the United States. You all know of the trend of closing coal plants in New England and around the country because you can substitute natural gas plants for them fairly easily. And as I indicated, I don't think we'll see too much change with alternative fuel either. The tax credits for solar are already on a legal schedule to expire in a couple of years, and that will probably run its course. But I don't think they'll be eliminated immediately. And the nuclear business is in big trouble because of the bankruptcy of Westinghouse. You all know about the bankruptcy of Westinghouse. So they're building plants for Southern Company and for the old Scana Company in South Carolina, but they're out of money. So they declare bankruptcy, and their employers want to know, how are you going to be able to perform and build me my nuclear plant? The Southern companies are going to have a showdown here shortly, and in their announcement, they said, we're not sure we're going to be able to build this plant, or plants, 2 plants, even though we've already spent many billions. If they go forward, they'll lose more money. So the nuclear outlook is dim. That's my little spiel about how the election has changed Washington. If you want to ask any questions, you can do so, or we'll move on. All righty, thank you all for your attention.